How many intermediates? How many advanced? You guys can do it. What I'm going to do tonight, I kind of tailor it to each individual group's needs. Some of these things are basic, but of course the old Army way is to start out assuming that you know nothing. And there are many different ways to do anything in wood turning. Wow, he's really good.
Oh, can you hear me on this?
So, some of these things, as I said, are going to be basics, but there are certain ways to do things that increase the efficiency of your operation. And those are some of the things that I look for, and I try to pass them on. I've been fortunate to study with some of the top wood turners in the world, and I was able to glean a little bit of this and a little bit of that from all these guys to use for my own purposes. I love to turn wood. I'm a retired photographer, but I've been turning for 26 years. And I've been fascinated by a lot of the different aspects of wood turning. The thing about the lathe is it's not deferred gratification like a lot of other woodworking techniques. There are a lot of varieties of objects that you can make. A lot of it may be value-added firewood. Remember, if you can't turn it, you can burn it. And I brought some samples of some of the variations of what I'm going to be showing you tonight. Don't hesitate to pick those things up. I carry them around, bang them up. They've already had a half-life in the back of the car for many, many trips, so they're not going to be finished and used. One thing I will also not do tonight is do any sanding or finishing, but we will talk about some of these processes as much as you want to. It's very important when you're a professional turner or any kind of a turner. The finish is not finished until the finish is finished. So you cannot cut corners with your sanding and your finishing and expect to end up with a quality product. And I'm really interested in a quality product because when you're trying to sell these things, especially in the market we have right now, there's very little market for art pieces. Now, those are the bowls that have holes in them that won't hold soup, right? Okay. Ambrosia, maple style, etc. So I'm going to start out with a project that was based on a need. And I happen to love pretty wood. Back in the old days when I was a pipe smoker, I think that was one thing that started me down the path of burls and pretty wood. I walked into Berea Hardwoods several years ago up in Cleveland. They had half of a bird's eye benga tree sliced, ready to be made into pin planks, 1 inch thick. It's some of the most beautiful wood I've ever seen. So I had to buy at least one slab of it to take home and figure out something I could make out of it because it's beautiful wood. And one of the problems that you have when you're a beginning turner especially is trying to figure out how am I going to fasten that thing to the lathe. Well, there are a variety of objects. When I started turning 25 years ago, we didn't have chucks. Well, there was one that was sort of a chuck. But most of the processes of using chucks came over from the metal shops. They were not scroll chucks. You had to adjust each of the 4 jaws independently. I still have one of those. But in that period of time, wood turning has really blossomed into a great hobby for a lot of retired guys that had a little money. And the wife wants you out of the kitchen. She says, go to the shop and make something, and we don't need any more furniture. So that's when you go to the wood pile and you try to figure out something you can make out of every little scrap out there. So starting to turn a fairly thin piece is what we're going to start with tonight because this is what we quite often have available to us. This is nothing but a piece of poplar glued to a piece of this fiddleback maple. I have a piece of wood that is already done this way to start handing around. And I'll talk about that one in a little while. This is what I'm going to make. And the way you start out is to glue that waste block. Do not use plywood. The separation of the layers can be just a little too exciting for me. We're going that way. Use a good solid wood like maple, poplar. Works very nicely. I have a neighbor across the street who works at a mill, and he brings me all the poplar I can possibly use. So free is good. My ethnic background is a little bit Scottish, and a little bit German. So I like to do things well in a frugal manner. So when you go to Woodcraft and buy a nice big square of Coca-Cola, what's the first thing people do? Well, they take it home and they take a compass and they draw a circle around in it, and they take it to the bandsaw and they cut off 20% of their investment. That's not the Scottish way to do things. So I started turning these square pieces, and there is a little bit of an element of risk. You don't want to have induced element of surprise, like having it fly off, or a little accident with your finger like that. You can put them back on with super glue. So the first thing I do to prepare this, I glue a round block on, and I'm very precise about my measurements. I have to tell you, first of all, my father and grandfather are engineers, and I'm dyslexic. So it was going to be Donaldson, Donaldson, and Dummy son. That's why I had to get married to get my checking account straightened out. I almost celebrated this trip and washed my smile, but I resisted. So it gets broken in on trips like this. In order to measure some of these things, you can have a ruler, you can do all kinds of things, but what I simply do is I stand above it like so, and I put a ruler across the four corners and mark it. And then I'm ready to put it up on the lathe. I take a punch and put a center hole that helps me center it real quickly. Now let me tell you right away, I have no use for these cone-type live rear ends at all. That's nothing but a wood splitter. Unfortunately, it's all we have. So when you're traveling, you learn to do with what's available. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. I really love the fact that in the last few years we have had so many of these variable frequency drive lathes come up to the market, because you can really pinch the snot out of your fingers trying to change belts on all these pulley things. So that's been a great innovation in lathe design. And in the last 20 years, there's been a real a blossoming of nice brand new equipment, nice lathes that didn't exist before all you guys retired and had created a market for them. So if you have any questions about equipment, I'm kind of an equipment fanatic. I love to play with it. I divide wood turners into two categories. You'll have the guys who are engineers they'll research a tool. They'll look at all the competing qualities of the other specifications of the competing tools. They'll go check them out at the store. Once in a while, they might even buy one. Then they'll take it home and they'll sharpen it, and they'll polish it, and they'll build a cabinet to put it in. And once in a great while, they might even use it. Now, the other guys are the ones that are production-oriented. They'll grab a piece of wood, slap it on there, grab whatever tool is handy, and make some shavings fly. So I sort of try to stay in the middle of those two groups. But I have to tell you that I'm sort of addicted to both.
Tell me again how you got that center of the building.
Corner to corner.
Okay.
Corner to corner. Same way if we were spindle turning, you do the same thing. You don't have to have a center finder to do that. This helps.
Corner to corner. And then you can happily glue it onto the square stock and you get it.
Well, then I have drawn a circle in the approximate center to tell me where to put the glue block approximately. And I don't measure them to a certain size or anything else like that. That gets me, ballpark is close enough for this. Because the first thing you have to do is to put it up on the lathe and recenter it with the tool. That's one thing that the lathe does really well, is make things round. And it's a little more difficult for it to make things square, but that's where the fun comes in.
Did you glue that material between his grab rollers? Block?
No, and who's the segmenter? What kind of glue do you use?
Hot melt.
Do we have any other segmenters in the Hot melt, Type Bond 1 and Type Bond 2. a Type Bond too because I have it left over from back when I used to be a real woodworker. And it works very nicely. It works better, according to the rumors that I hear, than Type Bond 3.
Yes, that's good.
Or super glue.
No, not necessarily. Because the problem with super glue, it can quite often give you a false sense of security. Super glue with the accelerator gives you a brittle bond. It's very easy sometimes with a good whack to break that bond. And besides, this stuff's a whole lot cheaper. Enough stated. Now to start this project, this is all you need to do. Now this is where you make sure that you have the lathe set at a relatively slow speed when you start. I don't do the Jimmy Clues thing and start up the turbo prop that just clears these guys out right here. I get nervous when I hear that thing cranked up to about 36,000 RPM. So I don't do that.
Jimmy's answer to how fast does it go?
Yeah. Well, I do most of my turning in 3 steps, and this is what we're going to do right now. Step 1, I've prepared the material. I've mounted it on the lathe with the tenon to be glued on the tailstall hand. All I have to do to turn this now and try, see he's moving. All I have to do now to start this turning is the friction from the chuck jaws are holding that onto the lathe very nicely. Now you don't do that with a big piece of burl that's out of balance or something else. This piece is in good balance, so I'm told. And when you crank it up, make sure, as I said, that the lathe is set at a slow speed. I turned my first bowl in shop class in 1959 in high school, and I can remember to this day the class clown coming in one day, and we were using bowl blanks that were glued together out of poplar, cherry, and walnut that came from the real woodworker side of the shop, glued together with hide glue. Well, smartass walks into the shop one day and he's got this blank up on the old General 260, and he flipped that sucker on and it was set at about 36,000 RPM, and it went through the ceiling that was about this high in the old gymnasium. And to this day, I can remember that sound. I have no problem whatsoever remembering start at a slow speed. You can always make it go faster. And it is not true that if you run the lathe in reverse, the wood goes back on. All right, safety. Yes, do pay attention to what you're doing, because I like to wear some gadgets. I happen to be the maintenance supervisor on the golf course where I live. I'm in charge of the trees.
So you're the top
Yeah.
You're at the Airmont School Symposium. I thought
That was my closest I'll ever come to second. But Mountain Tibbetts is a friend of mine.
I did the 3 of his demonstration camera work.
Okay, that's right. Well, Malcolm's wife and my wife went through chemotherapy together. Among other things. Terry made my wife do.
Will you be at Cabo this year?
Pardon?
Will you be at Cabo?
No, I'm sticking close to home this year. Well, now I got my zipper cut stuck.
So you almost washed that. You almost washed that.
There we go. I do like to have some sort of a chip deflector, because otherwise it ends up in your underwear. So quite often the first thing you do is untuck your shirt so it doesn't create a funk. These leather golf gloves work very nicely because this hide is tougher than this hide. And there are times, especially when you're dealing with dry wood, that stuff gets hot. It creates splinters. It can abrade the epidermis. Also, I'm going to be doing some turning. Now, it's very difficult to talk wearing a shield at the same time, but there are parts of this process where I wear it, parts will I wear not. But always wear eye protection. These are tempered glass safety glasses. I will not be caught anywhere near the lathe without at least my glasses on. Besides, I can't see what I'm doing without them, so I don't have to be reminded.
Should we have something?
You'll have shavings done. My tool of choice, the side ground bowl gouge. How many of you use this tool as a mainstay? Most people do these days. We talk about the fact of the Ellsworth grind, which means the bevel is at 60 degrees. Why is it 60 degrees? Because David Ellsworth said so. That works for me. He's God. Besides 60 works. There are several types of tools. There are several types of flute configurations. V-shape, U-shape, parabolic, whatever. I prefer the flutes that are wider because the reason that you have it there is to evacuate shavings. Now, the reason you also want to keep good sharp tools is the fact that a sharp tool is safer than a dull tool. And I'm a fanatic about sharp tools. So, as you learn to sharpen your tools, I'm a big advocate of using jigs, like the one-way gouge jig. It has a tendency to get you into some funny situations once in a while. I've been called off the plane 3 times when they x-rayed my check baggage and they found my meat cleaver. I was using to knock the bark off for a natural edge piece. The second time, they found my ray gun. They thought it was a breakdown pistol and I was hiding a barrel someplace. Have you ever tried to explain anything to TSA personnel? You might as well be talking to the wall. So anyway, I escaped eventually. Sharpening the side ground bowl gouge is best accomplished with something like the one-way gouge jig. If you have any questions about how to set your jig up, I recommend that you go to DougThompsonLatheTools.com. Doug has a full-size, life-size layout on how to position the arm on your one-way jig, and it works great. Heavens knows he's ground enough tools with it. So that's a good way to get a reference for the angles for your jig. Now, you can grind the wings back as far as you want to. It makes very little difference to the tool, but it makes a big difference in how you use the tool, and I will show that. And if any of you want to come up and see this, it's a little hard to see without video camera or something like that on the screen. But don't hesitate at any time to come up and stand around the leg. That makes it easier for me to put some shavings in your pocket. Here is the proper way to grind a gouge. You want an uninterrupted bevel all the way around the nose of the tool. You do not want a bunch of facets on it. You do not want a wing that has a high point here and a high point here. That is a guaranteed grabber. So make a nice uniform sweep. It should be either flat or slightly convex, never concave like this. And you do not want multiple bevels in front of the cutting edge. And you do not want a tip on the side sticking up that is higher than the cutting edge of the tip. That is an absolute guaranteed grabber. So, learning to sharpen your tools is a basic part of being a good turner. And then you learn how to use them after you learn how to sharpen them. I would pass this around if you have any questions about that or any questions about how to sharpen. Let me know. We all together so far? My weapon of choice is the 5/8 deep flute bowl gouge. Round, more or less like an Ellsworth. It's between an Ellsworth and a Jordan. It's sort of a jig. But it works, and I grind it because it does work that way. Some of the things you need to do when you buy a new tool, for example, a deep flute bowl gouge, almost every time you buy one, these two edges are going to be razor sharp. Take a whetstone, knock them down. You're going to spend hours and hours with your hand wrapped around that tool. Ray Key was one of my early teachers, and he always said that you want everything that you touch to be friendly to your hands. That includes your wood turners. You don't make bowls with sharp edges on them. Because when the lady walks into your booth and she picks it up, she goes like this, you're not going to sell that. But when she picks it up and she goes, like this, like as smooth as a baby's butt, cha-ching. All right, first procedure. Make the thing round, the tenon that is. Now, fighting with unusual lathes that I'm not always up on, it's really nice to have a robust comfort rest on there. Boy, I've got those in all my lathes. What we want to do is to first of all make sure that you rotate the piece by hand, because it's really disheartening to turn it on after you've been spending hours and hours turning it nice and thin, and you flip it on and it hits the tool rest and you get a cancel. So the first thing I'm going to do, make sure everything is tight, and I'm going to make a tenon. That's only part of a tenon. Let's talk about what a tenon really is. First of all, most chucks, most of you use chucks? Most of us do these days. There are a couple of things that are fairly universal about using tenons and chucks. Most of the chuck jaws are a ½ inch high. So you want the wood to have a nice square right angle to sit straight down on the chuck jaws, regardless of whether the jaws are dovetailed like Novas or serrated like Strongholds. The trick is you want two good surfaces next to each other, but you want the strength of the grip of the chuck to be here. Never allow the tenon to hit the bottom of the chuck jaws. Never, ever. So make sure that you have a gap there. It doesn't have to be very much, but if you leave this against this surface, that creates leverage, and those create projectiles. So always make sure that you have an air gap at the bottom of your tenon. Also make sure that when you cut that tenon, you don't have any waste wood right there at the corner where they meet, because that will keep that corner of the chuck jaw from gripping that wood securely. This has to be a good mating surface, because that's where the strength of the chuck comes from. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference to me whether it is serrated or dovetailed. I happen to prefer the dovetails because I think they give me a little bit better grip. And I don't really go out of my way to dovetail the tenon itself, because as you tighten the dovetail jaw down, it will grip this area tighter, which forces it deeper into the chuck jaws up here. The wood tends to move in that direction, which is why you don't want it touching down here.
So you don't do the little dovetail thing that
Yeah, it takes too much time. I cheat a little bit. Now when you're going to make that tenon, you do want to have a good shoulder on there, and this is how hard it is. No big deal. This has a little bit of a dovetail, because when I come in from this direction, I can adjust the angle that the tool goes in. Well, now the way you normally use a parting tool is to come in like this, remember? Not with that chop saw right there, you don't. The thing about turning square or any other irregular surface is you keep everything that's attached to you that you want to remain attached to you behind the tool rest. Because if you stick it through there, the wood's going to win. So that tool rest is a very important safety factor in your turning of pieces that have irregular surfaces like this. That's all I need to do for a chuck tip. Now the next part of the process is I need to start refining my shape for step one. This is the bottom. So we're going to make a winged piece that goes up this way a little bit, like the piece I handed around. And because we're dealing with a square piece that doesn't have very much thickness to it, we're not going to be making a very big curve here, but we do need to knock off these corners. Now this is where you need to wear your fixture. I'm going to get it started so you can see how I do that. Now, don't forget to check and make sure that you crank up that tailstock tight every once in a while, especially if you're dealing with green wood. So now you're going to start knocking off these outside corners. When you get out there to the edge, back off a little bit. I heard a chunk of this fly. Part of the problem is the fact that we're dealing with end grain, side grain, end grain, side grain. The tool is going to be in open air part of the time that the rotation is coming around to the tool. You cannot advance that tool real quickly into that wood because then you just created another projectile. Yes?
Question for you. On the speed of cutting a square like that, would you not increase the speed?
A little bit. I don't want a turbo prop.
I'm sorry?
I don't want a turbo prop. Yeah, you would increase it a little bit, depending upon the material you're working with. But here's what becomes the problem. As this piece of wood is rotating around, I'm cutting into an area that is not supported with wood behind it. That's why it chipped. You can eliminate some of that problem on a keeper piece by putting a coat of thin super glue. You can use, I use lacquer with a little bit of acetone in it. This is my magic elixir for a lot of things. It strengthens it a little bit. You can also put on some masking tape. Don't use duct tape. There is a limit to what you can do with duct tape, because all that does is make a gooey mess. But you don't need to put that across the end grain, because as you're cutting into that, it's supported. But when you get up here to that edge that is not supported, that's where it's more likely to split. Stuff happens. But you can use that as part of your design opportunity. Now, as I said, I'm just going to rough this out. I'm not one of those demonstrators who tries to make a finished piece, because you guys are going to be the ones that have to sand. I don't do sanding. Those ghost images as they come around. Also, leave a little bit of leeway in there so that you have a little bit of fudge factor in case the square is not exactly cut uniformly. So if you start going from this direction, you have a little bit of edge you can take away when you need to. You can't put it back on. But now I'm getting to the point where I'm ready to start thinking about my final shape. And my final shape is going to be curved like this. So now I have basically created a fairly good curve right here on the bottom, and this is the conclusion of step one. There's no point in trying to refine that surface at this step, because once you reverse that into the chuck jaws, it's not very likely going to be running perfectly true. So you'll have to do it again. Why waste your time? I mean, there are people who might even try to sand it at this junction. That's a waste of time. So go ahead and get ready to, I shouldn't be leaving it. I have, in my shop at home, I have a tool holder right here. I have the grinder right here. So I'm used to putting that tool right there. Never work around the lathe holding the tool under your armpit, doing something like this, because I've got a friend at home who doesn't wear shoes. It's ugly. Especially since he uses a steel rod. Another little trick. Every time you have to move that tool rest and you loosen it up, it does that. I put a little piece of PVC pipe on there, something that is a little bit larger than the diameter of the post. So when you put it down in there, it stops at the appropriate height. Little things like that make a huge difference in the efficiency of the amount of time you spend working at the lathe. You don't want to spend your time having to stop here and pick that thing up and down all the time. Now, I take it completely out to prevent accidents when I'm moving pieces over the ground. Now we're ready to put the tenon in the chuck jaws. But did we get it the right size? None of you have ever had the problem of creating a tenon and turning it around and it was either too big or too small, right? That never happens. Yeah. Magic tool. In a machine shop, this is called a go-no-go gauge. This is the minimum opening of the tenon in the chuck jaws that will fit. This is the maximum opening for this particular chuck. This will save you not only great aggravation, but profanity, tossed wood, all kinds of serious things that you shouldn't be doing. And I really recommend that this is so easy to make. Just make it out of a piece of plywood, make it out of anything, piece of plexiglass. That will save you a lot of heartaches and headaches when you're reversing things and use a chuck block. Okay? Now, of course, I didn't use it because I've been practicing a few times with this chuck. One other little thing. How many of you have a chuck that was made in the southern hemisphere and a chuck that was made in the northern hemisphere and they open and close in opposite directions? And until they came out with the Nova number 2, none of them told you which way to open it and which way to close it. Well, now, if I have this piece in here and I accidentally loosen it up, I have just ruined the project because now I have changed the orientation of my tips and my wings out here. So, all of my chucks that did not come with an indicator to tell me which way to open and which way to close, I engrave it with arrows so the dummy knows which way to open and which way to close. Now, those are the sort of things that somebody who should be required to use equipment take into consideration when they design it. I think any engineer that designs something should have to use it for a while. I mean, I had to drop the rear transmission mounts in my Ford 460 to change the number 8 spark plug. Duh! Or as my father said when we were talking about traffic engineers, woo! If those guys were real engineers, they wouldn't be working for the state. How many state engineers are there? Okay, now, how many of you have an old Nova chuck that has the 2 Tommy bars?